When it comes to narcissistic supply, some call it narcissistic fuel. I called it narcissistic relief. Whatever term you prefer to use, it's feeling good about yourself because you're better off than your neighbor. That's what it comes down to. For this to work, there must be someone in a worse state than you, or else there's no relief. So this relief seeking at the expense of someone else is a common thing in the human species. Ever since the fall of man, the main motivator in societies have been narcissistic supply. It's the same as being addicted to pills or to recreational drugs or to alcohol or whatever. It is an addiction. And no society wants to admit that they depend on narcissistic supply to keep the population in check. No society wants to admit this. That is why things as racism work. That's why things as classism, so when you divide society in classes, work also. Because when you do this, people will not notice immediately that it's narcissistic supply that everyone craves. It's not just the narcissist that longs for narcissistic supply. Commoners do also. But commoners are kept in check by societal expectations. Narcissists are hard to keep in check. That's why a lot of people are against narcissists. But hold on a minute. What a narcissist craves is what commoners crave also. They want to be validated at the expense of someone else. So there needs to be someone else that's excluded for them to feel important. And this is why worldly people are so often scammed and conned. Look, all human beings have this core-rooted need to be significant. We all have it. We don't deal with it the same way, each one of us. We all have it. In the world, they seek supply for this need for significance, and they get the supply at the expense of someone else. That's how it goes in the world. When you're born again and walking by faith, your need for significance is supplied without costing anyone else, because God supplies to you directly. Because the world doesn't feed from Christ directly, they feed at the expense of victims. The moment you point this out, people turn on you. The moment you reveal this shameful secret about society, people tend to label you a radical, or they'll become victimized instantly, and they victimize you. Why? Because this is something that is not supposed to be discussed. This is the big elephant in the room. Blood sacrifice. Blood sacrifice is what keeps society together. We are just not allowed to call it blood sacrifice, because once you call it what it is, blood sacrifice, that means there is a religious and spiritual connotation to it. And if it's religious, that means that you are relying on a belief system. And if it's spiritual, it means that it's not connected to Christ. It means it's connected to demons. That means it's devil worship. So blood sacrifice is a big taboo that's not allowed to be discussed under any circumstances in society. Even scholars who can see that blood sacrifice has continued till this day, they will not admit it. Why? They'll likely lose their job, or they'll lose promotion at work, so they don't risk their livelihood. I mention it for what it is. The human species is addicted to blood sacrifice. Yes, we are. We just don't want to admit it. But once you admit this, you'll understand why Christ wants you free from the world. That's why Christ wants you in the world but not of the world. The world is addicted to blood sacrifice. If all blood sacrifice would stop today, they would all turn insane, they would all become mad, and they'll commit mass suicide or begin to devour one another instantly. The human species, though to their fallen state, they need some target to unload their violence upon. Without a target to unload their violence upon, they self-destruct instantly. This is something that the world leaders know. That is why they come up with sitcoms. That's why they come up with those drama series. Have you ever wondered yourself why millions and millions are invested in drama series worldwide? Why is that? It is because in those drama series, you always have a scapegoat that everyone's against. And the viewer who sees the drama can identify himself or herself in the perpetrators and hate the figure that's played by the actor. This is a virtual form of blood sacrifice in which the anger of the viewers is displayed on this fictive character played by the actor. Now, in real life, people know that the actor is not that character, but they now have someone to be upset with. Or you may have violent video games in which you have a target that needs to be killed. This is a substitute form of blood sacrifice. Now, there's nothing wrong with playing video games. Video games can be fun. But some video games are so realistic, they are designed as a substitute blood sacrifice ritual. This addiction to blood sacrifice is something you will never hear on TV. You won't even hear it in those pagan churches, who, especially there, they won't talk about it. And here's another thing. Christ died and rose again. Why is it that in many churches they display a dead man on a cross? Why? Because they worship death. They get narcissistic supply by the fact they see a dead man hanging. Why don't they make a symbol that symbolizes the resurrection? In Protestantism, they only have a cross without anyone hanging on it. But the cross was a symbol of state sexual violence or sexual violence sanctioned by the state perpetrated on men. Whether they were criminals or not doesn't matter. That is what the cross symbolized. So the cross is a symbol of sexual torture. So why are we using symbols of sexual torture? Or why do we use that same symbol of sexual torture with a dying man on it to represent Christ? Something is quite off here. It is because pagan Christianity is all about providing narcissistic supply to the masses, but you do it in God's name. And because you do it in God's name, people don't know this. It's just narcissistic supply you're giving them. Just think about it. You go to church every Sunday hearing about this man who was murdered by the Roman government. And you're told it was on your behalf, which is true. And at least he allowed it to happen to himself for your benefit. That's true. But they don't emphasize the fact that he's risen. And they don't emphasize the fact that because he's risen, you are risen with him. So during this lifetime, you walk into resurrection power. That part is not emphasized. They emphasize his death. Why? Because worldlings rely on narcissistic supply that comes from blood sacrifice. It's something many people don't want to hear. I'm saying it for what it is. So don't be distracted by ethnicity. Don't be distracted by religion. Don't be distracted by language. Don't be distracted by any of those divisions. If someone is not born again, that means they are a sinner. And that means they're part of the world. They may not be as worldly as the common worldly individual, but still they're part of the world. And when you're part of the world, you are part of a structure that keeps itself in existence by blood sacrifice. And the longer you remain part of the world, the more invested you'll become in blood sacrifice. And the more invested you are in blood sacrifice, the less likely it is that you'll ever be delivered. That is why there are only two blood streams that you can rely on. You can never rely on both of them at the same time. One bloodstream is Christ's bloodstream, which is shed for you. That's a self-sacrifice of Christ that you're supposed to feed off. That's the only human sacrifice you're allowed to benefit from, because it's God offering himself on your behalf. So either you feed from Christ directly, or you rely on dead bodies of sacrificed victims. It's one of the two. You're either feeding off of corpses, and culture always makes this sound so patriotic and beautiful. Either you do that, which is vampiristic, or you feed off of the bread that came from heaven, who's Christ, who gave himself for us and who's risen on our behalf. So you either have the provision that the Holy Spirit gives, or you get narcissistic supply at expense of dead bodies. And with dead bodies, you have broken families, you have a lot of mental illness that went before the individual died. So you're either feeding off of your fellow human being, which is a cannibalistic attitude, or you have provision that comes from God. It's one of the two. So anyone that chooses to remain part of the world chooses to rely on blood sacrifice. So there's nothing innocent about holding on to the world. There is nothing that can justify not relying on Christ. The moment you are alert to what the world really is, it's your obligation to forfeit it by embracing Christ. Anyone that persists in holding on to the world, they are agreeing with blood sacrifice. They are agreeing with trauma bonding. They are agreeing with child molestation that's used by the pagan rulers to generate living sacrifices. They may not agree with the act directly, but if the world depends on it for it to function, and you embrace the world, you are keeping it in existence. Anyone who doesn't want to be associated with Christ chooses to be associated with blood sacrifice, which is cannibalistic and vampiristic. So it's one of the two. Which source are you taking part of? There's only one source really, who is Christ. And you have those evil spirits who are a counterfeit source. So actually there are not two sources, I correct myself. There's only one source, and you have parasites. Do you partake at the table of the parasites, which are evil spirits, or do you partake at the table of Christ, who's God himself? You don't have to answer that question to me. Just ask yourself, which table are you eating from? You can't eat from both at the same time. You're either eating from Christ or you're eating from the world. Be at peace.